They laughed when she walked in, not because she was new, but because she was the only black girl in a sea of white faces, and to them, that was enough. The looks weren't curious. They were loaded, as if her skin alone broke some unspoken rule. The jokes started fast. The whispers followed. And when they shoved her into the lockers and dumped glue in her locker, no one stood up. No one ever does. But then came the moment behind the gym. The moment he reached for her wrist, smirking like he owned the world. And the moment after, when he hit the ground so fast, so hard, that even the noise in his throat died before it reached the air. He didn't see it coming. No one did. Because when you're taught to treat silence like weakness and skin color like permission, you forget one thing. Power doesn't always speak. Sometimes it waits, then strikes. This isn't just a story about bullying. This is a story about control, about quiet endurance, and about a girl they tried to break for being different, until she showed them what different really means. And trust me, this story doesn't start with peace. It begins right at the breaking point. So if you're ready to see how silence becomes strength, hit that like and subscribe to follow the full series. Comment below what moment hits you the hardest, and where in the world you're watching from. Now ask yourself, what happens when the quietest voice in the room is the one no one can silence anymore? Elena Carter stepped off the school bus with practiced precision, her body hunched slightly under the weight of her backpack, her hoodie pulled low not from cold, but from instinct. The air in Riverdale, though crisp and clean compared to Chicago's heavy smog, still felt sharp against her skin, as if the entire town was waiting to see what kind of trouble the new girl would bring. She had learned a long time ago that in small towns like this, newcomers didn't get the benefit of the doubt. They got watched, categorized, and often quietly rejected. Riverdale High loomed ahead like a place that had seen too many students to remember one more, but Elena knew better. High schools were ecosystems, and newcomers were intruders until proven otherwise. She moved through the front doors with her eyes down, her steps quiet but firm, weaving around the clustered packs of students who barely noticed her, until she walked into classroom 211. The second she crossed the threshold, conversations dulled by a fraction, eyes flicked toward her, and then flicked away just as quickly. She scanned the room once and made for the back corner, the seat by the window that offered both space and shadow. She sat without hesitation, placed her notebook on the desk, and stared straight ahead, ignoring the low murmurs around her. Jason Miller noticed her the moment she walked in. He always sat near the center of the room, where he could see everything and everyone, and he had the presence of someone who believed the room revolved around him. He nudged his friend Tyler with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Check her out," he murmured under his breath. "Straight from Chicago. Think she speaks English or just broods all day?" Tyler snorted, and the two exchanged glances like they were already planning something. Jason didn't like mystery, and Elena's silence was a challenge that immediately irritated him. When Mrs. Winslow walked in, she barely spared Elena more than a glance. "Class," she said briskly, setting her tote bag on the desk. "We have a new student. Elena Carter. Make her feel welcome." No one clapped. No one spoke. A few people turned in their seats for a second, then looked away. Elena gave no indication she heard anything at all. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't nod. She just sat there, quiet and unreadable. 10 minutes into the lecture, a folded piece of paper slid across her desk. She glanced at it, not reacting, then carefully opened the paper without looking around. The message inside was scrawled in hurried handwriting, the ink slightly smeared but legible. "Welcome to Riverdale. If you're going to be mute, maybe sit on the floor like a dog." She stared at it for exactly 3 seconds, folded it twice, tucked it into the back of her notebook, and resumed copying notes from a board. She didn't look left or right. She didn't twitch, didn't flinch. She had seen worse. Across the room, Jason watched her carefully. He expected at least a frown, maybe a change in posture. Instead, she acted like the note meant nothing. That made her more interesting and more annoying. By the time the lunch bell rang, Elena was the last one to leave the room. She let the rest of the class spill out into the hallway before stepping into the current of bodies moving toward the cafeteria. She walked with purpose but kept her eyes down. She found the farthest table in the corner, the one near the wall, where no one ever sat unless they wanted to disappear. She set down her tray quietly, opened her water bottle, and began eating without pause. 5 minutes in, she stood to grab a napkin from a dispenser near the wall. When she returned, the tray was gone. No food, no trace, just an empty table. She glanced to the left, then the right. No one was laughing, no one was pointing. But she knew someone had done it. The absence was too deliberate. She picked up her backpack, walked out of the cafeteria, and didn't look back. In the bathroom, she stood at the sink, her hands gripping the cold porcelain. She looked at herself in the mirror. Her eyes were calm, too calm. Her chest was tight, but her face betrayed nothing. She had made it through the first day. She hadn't been hurt, not really, but she hadn't eaten either. She hadn't spoken a single word. She leaned closer to the mirror, her breath fogging the glass. "Don't give them anything," she whispered under her breath. Then she turned, dried her hands on her jeans, and walked out like nothing had happened. The second day began like the first, quiet, gray, and filled with the kind of tension Elena had come to expect. She left home early, her bag packed, her hoodie drawn tight around her face even though the weather was warmer. The sun was out, but the world still felt cold. The night before had offered no relief. She hadn't told her father about the note or the lunch tray. There was nothing to report, she told herself. It wasn't worth it. These things passed, eventually. She just had to wait it out. But as she stepped into the front hallway of Riverdale High, she could already feel the weight of eyes on her back. She walked past the trophy case, past the noisy locker clusters, and headed straight for her homeroom. She moved quickly, but not fast enough to avoid Jason Miller. He was standing beside Tyler again, leaning against a row of lockers, talking too loudly about nothing. As Elena passed by, Jason timed it perfectly, just a small shift of his shoulder, a casual pivot. His arm bumped hard into her backpack, sending the weight of it off balance. Her books tumbled out, scattering across the floor in front of 3 other students. One of them stepped back, the other 2 just watched. Jason turned to look at her, eyebrows raised in mock surprise. "Whoa, sorry," he said, clearly not sorry at all. Elena crouched down without saying a word, gathering her notebook, her folder, and the paperback she'd been reading. One of the corners was bent. She straightened it with her thumb, then stood and continued walking. Jason watched her go, his smirk lingering. "Cold," Tyler muttered. "She's like robot cold." Jason didn't answer. He was still thinking about how she hadn't flinched. Again, in class, no one spoke to her. The seat next to her remained empty. The teacher called her name for attendance, and she raised her hand without speaking. By the second period, students had stopped whispering around her, but the silence wasn't comfort, it was isolation. At her locker, Elena turned the dial slowly. It was an older model, rusty along the hinges. She clicked the numbers into place and pulled. The door creaked open, and she immediately froze. Inside, her extra shirt, folded neatly the day before, was covered in fine white powder. It clung to the fabric, settled like snow. She stared at it for a second, then touched it. Her fingers came away sticky. Not flour, not sugar, something chemical. Someone had poured powdered glue all over her clothes. She looked left, looked right. Nothing. No one near enough to be obvious. But several students were glancing her way from across the hall. Their eyes darted away the second she moved. She took the shirt out, held it up for a moment, then dropped it into the trash can beside the lockers. She didn't slam the locker door. She didn't cry, but her throat tightened. Her jaw set. She walked away. At lunch, she didn't go to the cafeteria. She sat under the stairs near the east wing, where the janitor usually parked his cart. She wasn't hungry anyway. Her hands smelled faintly of glue. The next 2 classes passed slowly. In English, the teacher asked for volunteers to read aloud. Elena kept her eyes down. She didn't want to speak. Speaking was exposure. Exposure was weakness. Jason passed her on the way out of class and didn't say anything, but his eyes held something sharper than usual, calculated curiosity. He wasn't done. As the final bell rang, Elena made her way back to her locker. She didn't expect it to be safe, and it wasn't. There, taped to the door, was a post-it note. 3 words. Big block letters. Speak or bleed. No name. No handwriting she could recognize. She peeled it off slowly, folded it, and put it in her pocket. She walked past Jason again as she exited the school, and though he didn't look at her directly, she knew he had seen. She knew because he chuckled as she passed, and that sound, low, smug, almost satisfied, lingered in her ears long after the door shut behind her. That night, she sat in her room with the window open, the cool wind brushing over her arms. She stared at the crumpled note in her palm. The white powder had left faint residue on her sleeve. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply closed her fist slowly until her knuckles turned pale. And then, quietly, she let go. The third day started with tension buried deep in Elena's spine. She could feel it before she even opened her eyes. The glue from yesterday had stained her spare shirt, and though she washed her hands thoroughly, there was still a faint residue left under her fingernails, a quiet reminder that someone had crossed a line, and no one would be held accountable. She arrived at school earlier than usual, hoping to avoid the growing attention, but the hallway already buzzed with quiet whispers that seemed to split apart just before reaching her ears. She didn't need to hear the words. She could read them in the glances. The damage wasn't just in what they did to her locker. It was in what they were starting to say. During second period, something shifted. When she walked into history class, she noticed the girl with copper hair, Naomi, who had offered her a soft smile on her first day, was already seated near the front, her back stiff, her eyes refusing to meet Elena's. There had been a moment, just a day ago, when Elena thought maybe, just maybe, Naomi might be the first person at Riverdale she could trust. But now, even from a distance, Elena sensed the tension in her body. The way Naomi's shoulders hunched forward when she saw Elena approaching. Elena took her usual seat near the back and said nothing. 5 minutes into class, Jason leaned over to Tyler and said something too low to catch, but the reaction was immediate. Tyler's eyes darted toward Elena, then to Naomi, and then he smirked. A few more students glanced around like they were in on a joke, and Elena felt the weight of the moment land in her chest. After class, while students packed up their things, Elena reached for her folder and caught the tail end of a conversation behind her. "They say she snapped at her last school," someone said. "Put a girl in the hospital, like ICU level." "No way," another voice replied. "She doesn't even talk." "Exactly. Scariest ones never do." The words weren't said to her, but they were meant for her. Elena stood slowly, turned, and saw that no one would meet her gaze. Naomi walked out quickly without a word, clutching her backpack strap so tightly her knuckles were white. By lunchtime, the whispers had spread. Elena entered the cafeteria as usual, moved toward the back tables, and sat alone. But this time, there was a different air in the room. Less curiosity, more fear. She noticed that 2 girls who had been approaching the same table changed course the moment they saw her. A boy at the next table leaned to his friend and muttered something while glancing at Elena's hands. She looked down at them. They were perfectly still, fingers resting on the edge of her tray. She didn't eat. She wasn't hungry. After school, as she made her way through the hallway toward the lockers, she saw Jason leaning casually against the far wall, arms folded, smile already forming. When she passed him, he stepped forward, keeping his voice low, but just loud enough to carry. "Hey, new girl," he said, pretending to sound concerned. "Rough week, huh?" Elena kept walking, but he followed just a step behind. "Listen, we've all heard stuff," he continued. "Chicago's a tough place, I get it. Maybe you're just dealing with things differently here." She stopped walking and turned to face him. Her eyes didn't flinch. She said nothing. "We could help," Jason said with mock sincerity. "You know, if you ever wanted to talk, we're friendly. You'd be surprised." Behind him, Tyler let out a low snort, and a couple of other students nearby turned just in time to catch Jason's smirk. "All you have to do," he added, "is open your mouth." He stepped back, nodded slightly, and walked off like a teacher who had just offered valuable guidance. Elena remained still for a moment longer, then turned back toward her locker. Inside, everything was untouched today. No notes, no powder, no threats. But the silence was louder than ever. That night at home, she sat in the kitchen with a cup of untouched tea. Her father was in the next room, watching the news, unaware that she hadn't said a single word to anyone all day. Elena stared at the steam rising from her mug and wondered how long this game would last. How long until Jason escalated again? How long until the school stopped whispering and started pushing? She didn't want to hurt anyone. She had promised herself that. But more and more, it felt like this place was daring her to forget that promise. The fourth day began with rain. Not heavy, not loud, but constant, the kind of steady drizzle that soaked through clothes slowly and crept under collars before anyone noticed. Elena stood under the awning by the school entrance for a moment before stepping inside, brushing a wet strand of hair from her forehead. Her steps were silent, her shoulders square, but inside her chest, the weight of the week pressed deeper than ever. Rumors had settled into whispers, and whispers had shaped silence. Even the teachers seemed to look at her differently now. Mrs. Winslow avoided eye contact during roll call, and Mr. Hart from history never asked her to speak in class, even when she was the only one who had done the reading. In the first class of the day, English literature, she opened her pencil case and froze. Her black pen, the same one she always used, was missing. In its place was a red pen she didn't recognize. It was slim, shiny, and uncapped. Across the barrel, written in permanent black ink, were the words, "The quiet get eaten first." She stared at the message, reading it twice, then a third time. She held the pen for a moment, then stood and walked calmly to the front of the classroom. Mrs. Winslow looked up, surprised. Elena held the pen out to her, without saying anything. The teacher took it, confused, then glanced at the writing. Her expression darkened for a moment, but she said nothing. "Thank you, Elena," she murmured. Elena returned to her seat. She didn't look around. She didn't have to. She could already feel the stares. At lunch, she sat at the same table as always, the farthest one in the back. She didn't eat. She stared out the window at the wet pavement, watched the rain slide down the glass in long, slow streaks. Her hands rested flat on the table, unmoving. Someone passed behind her and whispered, "Did you see her face?" No emotion, like she's dead inside. The voice was too familiar. Probably Tyler. Probably deliberate. She didn't react. In the hallway between classes, someone bumped into her shoulder hard enough to shift her off balance, but she caught herself before stumbling. The person didn't stop, didn't apologize. She didn't look back. She had begun to understand the pattern. Minor, deniable attacks, timed with just enough space to avoid blame. In gym class, Coach Jenkins blew the whistle and shouted, "Dodgeball today. Let's burn some energy, people." The students groaned and muttered, but most grabbed the rubber balls from the bin, without protest. Elena took her place near the back of her team side, trying to stay out of direct fire. But Jason was on the other team, and Jason never missed an opportunity. The game began, and within seconds, balls flew through the air like missiles. Elena ducked twice, sidestepped once, and avoided eye contact with everyone. Then it happened. Jason grabbed a ball, spun, and hurled it with full force. The rubber thudded against her ribs with a deep, echoing smack. The impact knocked the air from her lungs. She stumbled, but didn't fall. Everyone froze. Coach Jenkins turned. "Miller, what the hell was that?" Jason grimaced and clutched his shoulder. "Sorry, Coach. I slipped. Ball came out wrong. Think I twisted something." Coach narrowed his eyes, but didn't push. "Go ice it. You're benched." Jason nodded, rubbing his shoulder like it hurt. Elena stood straight again, her chest rising slowly as she forced herself to breathe evenly. Coach turned to her. "Carter, you okay?" Elena nodded once. "I'm fine." Her voice was steady, flat. The coach gave her a brief look, then resumed the game. Jason walked off the court with a slight limp, but when he passed behind her, he murmured, "Told you she's made of stone." Elena said nothing. Her ribs throbbed. Later in the locker room, as she changed in silence, she noticed a red mark blooming along her side. She touched it gently, winced, then pulled her shirt down and closed her locker. That night, she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the echo of the ball hitting her body looping in her mind. She hadn't cried. She hadn't cracked. But the pressure was building. Something inside her, quiet for so long, was beginning to shift. The pain in Elena's ribs had dulled into a deep bruise, the kind that pulsed when she bent or twisted too fast. But she made no mention of it to anyone. She'd mastered the art of swallowing pain without letting it show, yet something about yesterday's game stuck with her. Not just the impact of the ball, but the way Jason had looked so satisfied afterward. The way he always seemed more alive after pushing her a little further. That morning, she stepped outside and found her bike lying in the shallow concrete ditch next to the school fence. One of the handlebars was bent at an odd angle, and the rear wheel had been kicked in, spokes bent and twisted like fingers clenched in pain. Mud streaked the seat. She stared at it in silence. The wind was cold. Her breath came out in small white clouds. She bent down, picked it up slowly, checked the chain, then rolled it forward, barely. It wobbled with every step, but she didn't leave it behind. She walked it the rest of the way to school, her hands tightening on the handlebar as every eye she passed seemed to pretend not to notice. Inside the building, no one said a word. That was worse than laughter. Indifference had always cut deeper. She reached her locker and found nothing new. No note, no powder, no strange objects taped to the door. Somehow, that unsettled her more. The absence of cruelty made her wonder what was coming next. It felt like the silence before the fall. In chemistry, she sat in her usual spot, back row, second from a window. Her bruised side ached against the hard plastic chair. Jason arrived late, breezed in like he owned the room, and offered the teacher a fake apology about traffic. He took a seat 2 rows in front of Elena and leaned back, glancing around the room before locking eyes with her for half a second. She didn't blink, but she saw the smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Halfway through the lecture, Mr. Kellerman paused to ask a question about ionic bonding. He looked around, waiting for volunteers. Jason's hand shot up before anyone else. Mr. K, he said, I've got a suggestion, not a question. The teacher hesitated. Go ahead. Jason cleared his throat and raised his voice just slightly. I think we should consider separating students into different groups. Like, people who don't talk at all could maybe do assignments with AI instead. You know, since they're basically machines anyway. Laughter burst out from at least 5 corners of the room. Tyler chuckled loudly. Even the teacher, caught off guard, looked momentarily unsure of how to respond. Elena didn't look up. She didn't move. But under the table, her hand clenched into a fist, so tight her knuckles turned white. Her other hand rested flat on her notebook, unmoving. Mr. Kellerman cleared his throat awkwardly. Let's keep it respectful, please, he said, though his tone lacked conviction. Jason shrugged innocently and turned back in his seat, satisfied. Elena's jaw ached from how hard she was holding it shut. She didn't speak. She didn't give them what they wanted. But something inside her had begun to crack. After school, she walked her broken bike home in silence. Her father was already outside in the driveway, tightening bolts on the front wheel of his truck. He looked up when he saw her, eyes narrowing slightly at the crooked bike. What happened? He asked. She hesitated, then replied flatly. Someone knocked it over. Marcus wiped his hands on a rag, walked over, and examined the wheel. This wasn't knocked. This was stomped. Elena said nothing. She adjusted her backpack and looked toward the house. I'll fix it later, she said. Marcus studied her for a second longer, then nodded slowly. Dinner in an hour, he said. We'll talk after. Inside her room, Elena sat on the floor with her back against the bed, her eyes fixed on the closed door. She thought about Jason's words in class, about the laughter, about how easy it was for them to make her seem like something less than human. She wasn't angry, not yet, but her silence was beginning to feel less like protection and more like a cage. Elena didn't sleep much that night. She stared at the ceiling until dawn, the silence in her room thick and heavy. Every insult, every shove, every whisper echoed inside her like the ticking of a slow, merciless clock. She remembered the sound of her bike scraping against concrete, the red pen, the bruised rib. But more than anything, she remembered Jason's voice, smooth, condescending, always smiling. She heard it even now, layered over her heartbeat. The next morning, she left the house early, earlier than usual, hoping to cross the parking lot before the others arrived. But Jason was already there, leaning against the chain-link fence behind the gym, his arms crossed, his backpack at his feet. Elena spotted him too late. She could have turned. She could have taken the long way around. But she didn't. She walked toward the rear field with even steps, her shoulders square, her face unreadable. Jason watched her approach without saying a word at first, but when she was within a few feet, he straightened and stepped into her path. "I'm going to ask you one more time," he said, his voice quieter than usual, almost intimate in its mockery. "Who the hell do you think you are, coming into my school and acting like you're better than everyone else?" Elena didn't stop walking. She stepped to the side, trying to go around him. He moved again, blocking her. "You don't talk, you don't smile, you don't even flinch," he continued, voice rising. "You think that makes you strong? You think silence is strength." Elena's eyes met his, calm and steady. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Jason's jaw clenched. "Answer me, freak." She moved again. This time, he reached out and grabbed her wrist. It was a mistake. The moment his fingers tightened around her arm, something in Elena shifted. It wasn't rage. It wasn't panic. It was control. Pure, calm, absolute control. She moved before he even registered the shift. Her foot planted, pivoted, her free hand locking over his wrist as she twisted her body into the movement. With a swift, fluid motion, she pulled him forward, unbalanced him, and swept his leg out from under him. Jason landed on his back with a dull, surprised thud, the breath knocked out of him. His hand released hers instantly. Elena stood over him, her expression unchanged. No fury, no triumph, just clarity. She looked down at him and spoke for the first time in front of him, her voice low but clear. "I didn't come here to fight," she said. "I came here to learn. But if you keep pushing," she paused, "you'll learn too." Then she stepped over him and walked away, her backpack still on her shoulder, her pace unchanged. Behind her, Jason lay still for a moment, stunned more by the shock than the pain. Tyler arrived seconds later, hurrying across the lot after seeing the commotion from the hall. "What happened?" he asked, glancing between Jason and the retreating figure of Elena. Jason sat up slowly, brushing dirt off his sleeves. "I slipped," he muttered. "She didn't even touch me." But Tyler didn't believe him. Not really. Word traveled quickly. By second period, something had shifted in the way people looked at Elena. Not everyone knew what happened, but they knew something had. Jason didn't speak to her again that day. He didn't make eye contact. And when Coach Jenkins asked why his shirt was dusty during gym, he didn't answer. Elena, meanwhile, moved through her schedule as usual. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. But her steps were just a little firmer, her shoulders a little straighter. That evening, she sat across from her father at the kitchen table, a plate of untouched food between them. Marcus studied her silently for a moment, then said, "You stood up for yourself today, didn't you?" Elena looked at him, startled. "How do you know?" He shrugged. "I've seen that look before. In the mirror. You're not proud of what happened, but you're not afraid anymore either." She didn't answer. He reached across the table, set his hand gently over hers. "You didn't ask for this fight," he said. "But now that it's found you, don't let them teach you fear. You already know how to stand. Now show them you know how to stay standing." Elena nodded slowly, her hand closing around his. She didn't know what would come next. But for the first time since arriving at Riverdale, she wasn't looking down anymore. The next morning, the halls of Riverdale High felt different. Not louder, not quieter, just heavier, like the building itself was holding its breath. Elena noticed it as soon as she stepped through the front doors. Conversations that once paused when she passed now continued, but with a subtle shift in tone, a wariness that hadn't existed before. She walked to her locker and found it untouched again, not a single mark, not a note, not a smear of powder or insult carved into the metal. That should have brought relief, but it didn't. It only confirmed what she already sensed. Jason hadn't just been humiliated the day before, he'd been knocked off balance. And when someone like Jason loses his footing, the entire power structure starts to wobble. Elena closed her locker gently and made her way to first period. Her eyes focused forward, her pace calm, unhurried. When she entered the classroom, heads turned, not sharply, not dramatically, but instinctively, as if everyone had suddenly become aware of her presence in a way they hadn't before. Jason was already there, seated at his usual spot near the center, but this time he wasn't talking. He wasn't leaning back or cracking jokes. His right wrist was wrapped in a white bandage, clumsily taped. He cradled it slightly, as if unsure whether to show it or hide it. Tyler sat 2 seats away instead of beside him, and even he wasn't laughing this morning. When Elena walked past them and took her seat, Jason didn't look at her. That silence spoke volumes. During the lesson, Mr. Kellerman announced a group project and began assigning roles. "You'll be working in pairs," he said, "but I'm letting you choose partners today. Let's try maturity for once." He looked down at his clipboard. "Carter," he said, scanning the room. "Anyone want to pair with Elena?" For a brief moment, the room froze. In past weeks, this question would have been followed by silence or awkward glances toward the floor. But today, after 3 seconds of stillness, a hand went up. Naomi. Quiet, careful Naomi, sitting near the windows. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She just raised her hand and said, "I will." Mr. Kellerman nodded, then looked around again. Another hand went up. Michael, a kid from the debate club. "If you need a group of 3, I can jump in." Elena blinked once, then slowly turned toward Naomi. Their eyes met for the first time since the rumors had spread. Naomi gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The teacher continued assigning groups, but Jason sat completely still, his hand clenched around his pen, his jaw tight. He stared at the back of Naomi's head, then at Michael, then at Elena. No one was looking at him for answers anymore. At lunch, Elena took her usual seat in the corner of the cafeteria, but this time she wasn't alone. Naomi walked over, set her tray down across from Elena, and sat without asking. There were no greetings, no forced smiles, just a quiet acknowledgement. A few minutes later, Michael joined them too. They ate in silence, but it was not the silence of discomfort. It was the silence of mutual understanding. A few heads turned. A few whispers passed between tables. Elena felt them, heard them, but didn't react. Jason sat at his usual table near the center, but Tyler had moved to the edge, and Courtney and Brianna weren't there at all. He was surrounded by people, yet completely alone. His plate remained mostly untouched. He glanced across the cafeteria, his eyes landing on Elena's table, and for the first time in weeks, there was no smirk on his face. No amusement, just confusion, maybe even doubt. That afternoon, in gym, Coach Jenkins had the class running warm-up laps. Jason lagged behind, his wrapped wrist held stiff at his side. Elena jogged at a steady pace, keeping her distance, her breathing controlled. When she passed him on the 3rd lap, Jason muttered under his breath, "You think you won?" She didn't slow down, didn't turn her head, just kept running. That night, Jason sat in his room with an ice pack pressed to his wrist and music playing low in the background. He scrolled through his phone, checking messages. There were fewer than usual. No texts from Tyler. No group chats buzzing with energy. For the first time since sophomore year, Jason Miller felt irrelevant. He didn't understand how it had shifted so fast, how one girl, who barely spoke, had managed to unravel everything he'd built. And worst of all, she hadn't even tried. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't raged. She'd simply refused to be small. That was what scared him most. The quiet ones always scared him most. By the end of the week, the hallway felt unfamiliar to Jason, not because it had changed, but because the energy around him no longer bent to his presence the way it used to. People still parted slightly when he walked by, but it wasn't reverence, it was hesitance. They weren't laughing with him anymore. They were watching him. Watching Elena too. Especially Elena. She didn't walk like someone who had won a battle. She walked like someone who had decided she no longer needed to run. Her chin was higher now, her steps measured and steady. She still sat in the same spots, still didn't raise her hand in class, still kept to herself most of the time, but the silence around her had changed tone. It was no longer isolating. It was commanding. Jason felt it in the way others reacted to her, in the way Naomi now waited for Elena at the end of third period, or how Michael passed her notes about assignments without hesitation. He told himself it didn't matter, that she wasn't a threat, that people would forget. But when he saw Elena in the hallway between second and third period, standing by her locker with one hand resting casually on her bag, something in him snapped. He stepped forward, loud enough that a few heads turned. "Hey," he said, voice sharp. "You think I'm scared of you?" Elena turned slowly, her face unreadable. She didn't flinch. She didn't speak. She simply looked at him. 3 seconds passed. Long, steady, quiet seconds. Jason shifted his weight, felt the eyes around them multiplying. He opened his mouth to speak again, but no words came. Elena didn't break eye contact. She didn't need to. The moment had already said everything. Jason scoffed, turned sharply, and walked away, pretending it was his choice to retreat. But everyone knew it wasn't. Elena returned to her locker, zipped it closed, and headed toward her next class. At lunch, she took her usual seat at the far corner of the cafeteria. Naomi was late, probably stuck in the library. Michael had told her earlier he wouldn't be eating today. Elena didn't mind. She liked the quiet. Her tray sat untouched in front of her as she read through notes, eyes focused but distant. Then something unusual happened. A boy she didn't know well, a sophomore maybe, walked up with his tray, looked at her, and hesitated. He was thin, pale, with a nervous energy that made him look like he wanted to disappear. Elena remembered seeing him once outside the nurse's office, holding an ice pack to a bruised cheek. She remembered how no one had talked to him. He didn't say anything now, just stood near her table, shifting slightly. She looked up, met his eyes, then nodded once. He sat, slowly, on the opposite end. Not close, not presumptive, just near enough to share space. They ate in silence. No words passed between them, but Elena could feel it, a quiet kind of respect, a recognition. By the end of lunch, a few students had noticed, whispered. But no one laughed. No one mocked. Even the ones who once would have giggled at the sight of someone like her sharing a table with someone like him now sat still, watching. Jason saw it too, from his table 3 rows away. He saw the boy sit down, saw Elena allow it. He saw the way her presence no longer invited ridicule but caution. He hated that. Hated how quickly it had all unraveled. Tyler barely spoke to him anymore. Courtney had switched lunch tables. Even his jokes during fourth period now landed with a thud instead of a chuckle. That afternoon, Elena passed him again in the hallway. This time, he didn't even try to speak. He just watched her walk past, the same way everyone else did. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Her silence wasn't submission anymore. It was a line drawn in stone. That night, Elena sat by the window, watching the sky shift from blue to deep gray. The storm hadn't broken yet, but she could feel it coming. Not outside, inside the school. Inside Jason. Something told her he wasn't finished. But she also knew now, neither was she. The whispers had changed direction. Where once they followed Elena like smoke, curling behind her back and staining her silence, now they clung to Jason like shadows that wouldn't peel away. People didn't avoid him, not exactly. They just no longer leaned in. Conversations ended when he arrived. Group partners were already taken before he asked. And when he did speak, his words landed like dropped stones, flat, heavy, ignored. On Monday morning, his name came over the intercom during third period. "Jason Miller, please report to the principal's office." The whole class turned to look. Jason blinked slowly, then stood with a shrug like it meant nothing, but his neck flushed red as he walked out. Elena sat at the back, eyes on her notes, unmoved. In the principal's office, the air was cold and smelled faintly of lemon polish. Mr. Braddock, a tall man with deep lines around his mouth, gestured for Jason to sit. He didn't ask if Jason knew why he was there. He went straight to the point. I've received reports of ongoing behavioral issues involving you and another student, Mr. Braddock said. Specifically, incidents in the hallway and behind the gym. Is there anything you'd like to tell me before I proceed? Jason didn't speak right away. He stared at the desk, trying to calculate the safest answer. I don't know what you're talking about, he muttered. Mr. Braddock leaned back, unimpressed. Jason, I'm asking you directly. Did you confront Elena Carter behind the gym last Thursday? Jason hesitated, his fingers drumming lightly against his thigh. I don't remember it being a big deal, he said finally. We talked. That's it. Did you touch her? Jason froze. No. She overreacted. So you're saying she attacked you unprovoked? Jason shifted in his seat, eyes narrowing. I didn't say that. Mr. Braddock studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly and made a note on his pad. You can return to class. We'll be speaking again. Jason left the office with clenched fists and a storm in his chest. No one had ever talked to him like that before, not without fear, not without calculation. And worst of all, no one had come to his defense. That afternoon, in chemistry, the tension reached its breaking point. Jason sat in the middle of the room, surrounded but utterly alone. Elena was 3 rows behind him, taking notes like always, her posture as still as stone. The teacher asked a question about molecular bonds. No one answered. Jason raised his hand, but wasn't called on. He let his hand fall and turned in his seat, facing Elena fully. You know, he said loudly, it's really funny how you're always so quiet. All mysterious, all calm. But you're just hiding. You think you scare me? You don't. No one's scared of you. The room froze. The teacher looked up but didn't interfere. Jason leaned forward, voice sharp. Say something. Come on. Say anything. You're not better than the rest of us just because you refuse to speak. Elena didn't respond. She didn't raise her head. She kept writing, her hand moving steadily across the paper. Jason slammed his hand down on his desk. Elena, he barked. Say something. Still nothing. But the rest of the class, all of them, turned to look. Not at her, at him. The silence that followed wasn't in her direction. It was pointed squarely at Jason. The teacher stepped in finally, voice calm but firm. That's enough, Jason. Please face forward. Jason blinked, looked around, and saw that no one was laughing. No one was nodding. He wasn't commanding attention anymore. He was begging for it. After class, Elena walked past him without hesitation. He didn't try to stop her. He couldn't. His voice was loud, but hers had become something louder without ever needing to rise. That night, Elena sat on her bedroom floor, legs crossed, her hands resting on her knees. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. But for the first time since arriving in Riverdale, she felt the weight on her shoulders begin to shift. Not disappear, never that, but redistribute. Jason had tried to define her by silence. Now his own noise was the thing no one wanted to hear. The cafeteria was quieter than usual that Friday, not in volume but in tone. Conversations were softer, eyes less sharp, movements more careful. It was as if the entire student body had begun adjusting itself to a new rhythm, one without Jason Miller at the center of it. He still sat in his usual seat at the long table near the middle, but now he sat alone. No Courtney, no Tyler, no background laughter that signaled power. Just Jason, picking at a sandwich he hadn't touched in 20 minutes, his eyes downcast, his posture closed. Across the room, in the corner that once symbolized isolation, but now radiated quiet strength, Elena sat with her back straight, a novel open in front of her, unread. She wasn't hiding anymore. She didn't need to. She didn't look over at Jason, didn't acknowledge the whispers that still occasionally followed her, didn't scan the room to see who watched her now with respect instead of suspicion. She simply existed, in full presence, in full calm, like someone who no longer had anything to prove. A few students glanced at her table as they passed but said nothing. Some nodded. A few smiled. She returned none of it, not out of coldness, but because acknowledgement, for her, didn't require performance. She had never sought attention, only space. Now she had it. Midway through lunch, a small figure approached her table. Elena didn't look up right away. She heard the tentative footsteps before she saw the girl, a freshman, maybe, with her tray clutched tight against her chest like a shield. The girl hesitated, standing a few feet away, shifting her weight from foot to foot. Finally, her voice broke through the hum of the cafeteria. "Can I ask you something?" Elena closed her book, set it down beside her tray, and nodded once. The girl stepped closer. "Were you ever scared?" she asked, barely louder than a whisper. "Of them, of him, of all of it." Elena studied her for a moment. The girl's eyes were wide but searching, not pleading. Elena could see herself in that gaze, herself from weeks ago, quiet and tired and afraid. She answered softly, "I used to be." The girl swallowed. "So how did you stop?" Elena's voice remained calm, her words slow. "I didn't stop being scared. I just got more scared of what would happen if I didn't do anything." The girl looked down at her tray, then nodded quietly. Without asking, she sat at the far edge of the table, close enough to share space, far enough not to intrude. Elena didn't stop her. A few moments passed, then another student, one of the juniors from the music program, walked by, paused, and joined them as well. No one said much, but something was building. Not noise, not attention, respect. Jason watched from across the room, his eyes tracking the small gathering around the girl he had once tried to break. He didn't understand how it had turned so completely, how someone who never fought back with fists or insults had managed to unmake him in front of the entire school. He had thought control came from dominance, from fear, from commanding attention. But she had shown him something else entirely, that control could also come from stillness, from holding the line and refusing to bend. And once people saw that, once they believed in it, his power meant nothing. That afternoon, after the bell rang, students poured out of the cafeteria into the corridors, ready for the weekend. Elena walked to her locker, moved her books carefully, and zipped her backpack without rushing. As she turned to leave, she saw Jason leaning against the far wall near the exit, his eyes already on her. He didn't say anything. Not this time. Not even a look of defiance. Just a flicker of something Elena couldn't quite define. Regret, maybe. Or recognition. She didn't return the stare. She just kept walking. Past him. Through the door. Into the sunlight. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the rooftops, casting long shadows across the quiet neighborhood, Elena sat on the front steps of her house with her father. Marcus passed her a mug of tea and said nothing for a while. Then he asked, "Was it worth it?" She thought for a long moment before answering. "Yeah," she said quietly. "Not because I won, but because I didn't let them decide who I had to be." He nodded, taking a sip of his own drink, pride in his silence. Inside the school, Jason sat in the now empty cafeteria, the room echoing around him. He wasn't a king anymore. He was a shadow. And Elena had never tried to be queen. She had simply refused to be ruled. The end. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to like and subscribe. It really helps us bring more meaningful stories your way. Which part of Elena's journey hit you the hardest? Was there a moment that reminded you of someone you know, or maybe even yourself? Let us know in the comments. Also, we'd love to hear where you're watching from. Drop your city or country below and join the conversation.